asked my daughter-in-law where the ring was, and she said, "I sold it long ago." The words didn't just sting. They burned, echoing through my chest like a betrayal I hadn't prepared for. The kitchen was quiet, except for the ticking clock above the fridge. But inside my head, everything roared. The sunlight coming through the lace curtains suddenly felt cruel, exposing the lines on my hands, the empty place on the table where the ring box used to sit. For 50 years, I had believed certain things were sacred. Love, vows, promises sealed with gold. And yet, in that single moment, my entire sense of family shifted. The casual way she said it, as if it meant nothing, as if my memories, my sacrifices, my son's vows had all been reduced to cash in her purse. It was more than disrespect, it was erasure. I held my breath, steadying my hands on the edge of the counter, and told myself not to cry. Because this wasn't just about a missing ring. This was about everything I had given, and everything she had already taken. The silence after her words pressed down on me heavier than any scream could. I remember turning my head toward the window, watching the neighbors' wind chimes move in the September breeze, and thinking how they sounded gentler than the woman standing in front of me. My daughter-in-law had that practiced smile on her lips, the kind people wear when they believe they've won a game nobody else realized they were playing. I forced myself to sit down at the table, the same table where we had celebrated birthdays, where my son once kissed her hand with such adoration it almost brought tears to my eyes. And now that very hand had pawned off the symbol of our family's union without hesitation. I thought back to the beginning, before she was my daughter-in-law, when she was just the girl with perfectly painted nails and a quick laugh that swept my son off his feet. He was so proud when he introduced her, his voice carrying that mixture of nerves and infatuation that only young men have when they believe they've found forever. I wanted to trust her. I wanted to see what he saw. And so I did. I opened my home, my heart, and every corner of my life to her. I cooked her favorite meals, asked about her childhood stories, pretended to laugh at jokes that made no sense to me, all because my son's eyes sparkled whenever she was in the room. But over time, small cracks appeared, the kind that only mothers notice. The way she checked her phone during Sunday dinners, ignoring the stories my husband loved to tell. The way she rolled her eyes when I reminded my son to wear his coat in winter. The way she seemed almost bored with him, even when he was bending over backwards to please her. At first I told myself it was just youth, just adjustment, just the normal grind of marriage. Yet those cracks widened, and I saw how she spoke to him when she thought no one else was listening. Not harsh enough to leave bruises, but sharp enough to cut his confidence piece by piece. I watched the boy who once believed he could build anything with his hands start second-guessing himself before picking up a hammer. I watched him grow quieter at family gatherings, as if shrinking himself so she could shine. And through it all I stayed silent, convincing myself it wasn't my place. Because what kind of mother meddles in her grown son's marriage? But then came the ring. That ring wasn't just metal. It was the same band I had kept safe for decades. The one my husband gave me on our 21st anniversary, when we could finally afford something more than a thin gold band. He had worked double shifts at the factory for months just to surprise me. I remember the way his calloused hands trembled when he slipped it on my finger, his eyes wet with pride because he had finally given me something he thought I deserved. When my son proposed, I passed that ring down to him. It wasn't just jewelry, it was a piece of our family. A history of sweat, sacrifice, and unspoken devotion. And to hear that she had sold it long ago, as if it were some trinket from a thrift shop, ripped through me like claws. I wanted to ask when, how much, why, but all I managed was silence, because part of me was terrified of the answers. That night, after she said those words, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling fan moving in slow circles, remembering every moment that ring had touched my life. I could still see my husband's rough hands, the oil under his nails from the factory, his shy grin when he gave me that ring. And I thought about how my son slipped it onto her finger under the oak tree in our backyard, the same tree he used to climb as a boy. I had felt so proud, as though love had been passed from one generation to the next. But the more I thought, the more my chest tightened. Something in her casual tone, that smirk she wore, told me the story wasn't as simple as pawning it once in a moment of desperation. She had said long ago, which meant years, which meant lies. The next morning, while the house was still quiet, I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table with my old notebook. I wrote down every memory I could recall about that ring since the day I gave it to my son. The date of the proposal, the photos from the engagement party, the last time I had clearly seen it on her hand at Thanksgiving, 3 years ago. After that, I remembered only excuses. She had stopped wearing it because it didn't match her outfit. Or she claimed she left it in a drawer because I didn't want to lose it at the gym. Each excuse I had, brushed off at the time, now seemed like a thread in a much darker fabric. Something inside me, a stubborn ember from years of being underestimated, told me to dig deeper. I opened my laptop and pulled up the family photos on Facebook. There it was. The engagement dinner, her hand lifted, the diamond catching the light. The baby shower photos, no ring. Christmas that year, no ring. Each missing moment marked a timeline of truth hiding in plain sight. I felt my pulse quicken as if I were chasing shadows. But then came something solid, a bank statement. I still handled some of my son's paperwork back then, before they merged accounts. I went to the old files and pulled a box from the closet. Receipts, statements, bills neatly folded and dated. And tucked between them, I found it. A transfer slip dated 2.5 years ago, $3,200 deposited from a pawn shop. The name of the shop was scrawled across the top, Golden Time Jewelry. My hands trembled as I traced the letters. I knew that place. It was 2 streets away from her old workplace. She had sold it without hesitation, pocketed the money, and never once confessed. But it wasn't just the ring. As I went through more records, a pattern emerged. Small withdrawals that didn't add up. Designer handbags she flaunted at family events. Shoes she claimed were gifts from friends. But the receipts told a different story. Luxury bought with money siphoned from accounts I knew my son couldn't afford on his salary alone. He had been stretched thin for years, working overtime, and yet she always looked like she had stepped out of a boutique window. My throat burned as I realized the scale of it. It wasn't carelessness. It was a scheme. I knew I needed to see it with my own eyes. That afternoon, I took the bus into town and walked to Golden Time Jewelry. The bell above the door jingled, and the air smelled of metal polish and cheap cologne. Behind the counter stood a man in his 40s with glasses slipping down his nose. I clutched the transfer slip in my hand and asked him straight out, "Do you remember a woman bringing in a diamond ring around this date?" He glanced at the paper, then at me, and sighed. "Lady, I see a lot of rings." I reached into my purse and pulled out a photo from the engagement. Her hand lifted, the diamond catching the sunlight. His eyes narrowed. "Yeah," he said finally. "That's the one. Came in a few years back. She was in a hurry. Didn't haggle, just wanted the cash." My stomach dropped. He remembered. He confirmed what I already feared. And worse, when I asked if it had been resold, he nodded. "Long gone," he said. Someone picked it up the next week. That meant there was no chance of ever getting it back. The history, the love, the legacy, gone in exchange for a few $1,000s she had probably spent in weeks. I thanked him and walked out into the bright sunlight, but it felt as though the entire world had gone gray. I stood on the sidewalk, gripping the photo in one hand and the pawn slip in the other, and I realized the truth. This wasn't about a ring anymore. This was about my son living in a marriage built on lies, about a woman who could erase decades of family sacrifice for a shopping spree. And suddenly, I knew I couldn't stay silent, because if I stayed quiet, she would keep taking, until there was nothing left but ashes. When I got home from the pawn shop that day, I placed the slip and the photo on the kitchen table, lined them up side by side, and just stared at them. My hands were steady, but inside me there was a storm that had been brewing for years, finally breaking open. I thought about my son, the way he dragged himself home after long shifts, the tired smile he gave me when he said, "Mom, I'm fine." even though his eyes told me otherwise. I thought about how he once dreamed of building his own workshop, starting a business with his hands, and how those dreams had shrunk smaller and smaller under the weight of her demands. And now I understood why. She had drained him dry. One purchase, one lie, one pawned family heirloom at a time. I made myself a pot of coffee and sat there for hours, replaying every moment. Her excuses, her shopping bags, the way she dodged questions about bills. It all added up. And then, as though fate wanted to prove me right, I heard a sound. The soft buzz of her phone left on the counter. She had gone upstairs for a shower, and the screen lit up with a message before dimming again. I shouldn't have looked, I know. But after what I had just uncovered, after years of biting my tongue, I told myself I had every right. My hands trembled as I slid the phone closer and tapped the notification. It was from a number saved as C. The message read, "Don't worry, I'll cover the next payment. Just make sure he doesn't find out." My breath caught in my throat. Next payment? Cover what? I scrolled quickly, my pulse hammering in my ears. The thread was filled with references to money, transfers, promises to keep things quiet. And then one line that made my stomach twist into a knot. If his mom keeps asking questions, we'll need to be more careful. His mom. Me. She was writing about me to some shadow on the other side of that thread, plotting how to keep me in the dark. I heard the water shut off upstairs, and my body moved faster than my thoughts. I put the phone back exactly where it had been, wiped my sweaty palms on my apron, and forced myself to pour another cup of coffee, as if nothing had happened. But inside, something had shifted permanently. I wasn't just suspicious anymore. I had evidence. Receipts, dates, bank transfers, even a pawnshop witness. And now, messages that hinted at something bigger, something beyond just shopping habits. That night, when the house was asleep, I went into my room and pulled out the wooden box from under my bed. Inside were the things I had kept hidden for decades: my marriage certificate, my husband's letters from when he worked out of state, and a small notebook where I had once tracked every penny of our household budget when times were hard. I placed the pawn slip and the photo inside that box, and for the first time in years, I locked it. Because now it wasn't just nostalgia. It was evidence. I decided then that I would not go to my son right away. No. I had seen how blind love can make a person. If I confronted him too soon, he might side with her, defend her, turn his anger on me instead of her lies. I needed to be careful. I needed a plan. And so I began watching more closely. I kept track of when she left the house, how long she stayed out, what bags she came back with. I noted down license plates of cars that pulled up to the curb when my son wasn't home. Each detail went into the notebook, my quiet ledger of truth. And the more I observed, the more I realized this wasn't just about money. She was living a second life right under his nose. New clothes, late-night outings, messages she erased the moment they came in. She wasn't just betraying our family financially. She was betraying him in every possible way. And with every note I wrote, every clue I gathered, my resolve hardened. I was not going to let her bury my son in lies. I was going to expose her. But I had to do it the right way. Slowly, carefully, with proof no one could deny. That's when the idea came to me. If she thought I was just a tired old woman who didn't understand phones and passwords, then she was going to underestimate me. And underestimation is the first mistake of every liar. I started by making a list, not the scattershot kind that lives on sticky notes, but a careful counted ledger: dates, receipts, messages, the pawn slip number, the clerk's name, the $3,200 figure, the nights she said she was working late, October 12th, March 3rd, June 21st, the occasions she'd forgotten the wedding anniversary when my son called to check in. I wrote in ink because ink feels permanent in a way typing never does. I bought a new, cheap voice recorder and tucked it into the potted fern on the porch. I learned its little quirks so I could place it without being obvious. I called an old friend from the neighborhood, Maria, who runs a modest bookkeeping service, and I asked if she would quietly look at some paperwork with me. Not as an accusation, but as an elder seeking advice. Maria came over the next afternoon with a thermos of coffee and sat at my kitchen table while I spread out the receipts and the transfer slip like a crime scene. She didn't gasp. She didn't judge. She only nodded, and with that clear, practical voice she's always had, said, "This is not small. You should take this somewhere it matters." I called a lawyer I had known for years, the one who helped me with my mother's will, and I asked him a series of practical questions, careful to sound like a confused client, not a plotter. Could a pawn slip be used as evidence? Could we subpoena records? What about suspicious transfers from joint accounts? He answered clearly, yes, yes, and maybe. He warned the obvious pitfalls. If my son had ever authorized access, if accounts were mixed, if she had plausible deniability. His caution was useful. It taught me to be surgical, not theatrical. I hired him to send a discreet letter, nothing accusatory, simply a request for financial documents and an offer to mediate. The goal was to nudge, to see how she would respond under gentle pressure. Liars trip when they're cornered, and I wanted to see that stumble on camera. Next, I recruited a small, unlikely squad. Maria agreed to look into her accounting network for anomalies. The pawnshop clerk, whose name I now knew, Tom, gave me the name of the buyer who'd bought the ring, a resale shop called Weekend Treasures, license plate recorded in the pawnshop ledger. I drove there 2 afternoons later, pretending to browse, while my recorder sat under my coat. Inside, a young woman with a loud laugh and a nose ring asked if I wanted to consign. I asked about a ring similar to this, and watched her face. She hemmed, then said, "We had something like that months back. People come and go." When I gently mentioned the pawn slip date, she shifted. "Someone came in with cash," she said. "Old story." Her evasive tone told me 2 things. Either she'd been coached, or she was used to selling pieces and moving on. Either way, she would be useful. Over the next weeks, I set small traps. I started to pay more attention to my son's bank notifications, the tiny alerts that show up on the lock screen when a card is used. I pleaded with him to let me help, organize the bills for just one Sunday, using the excuse of cleaning up paperwork from my own estate matters. He agreed, oblivious, trusting me the way only children in their 40s still trust their parents. I sat next to him at the kitchen counter, his head bent over bills, the lamp casting a circle of light on the paper, and I watched him sign a grocery receipt casually while his phone buzzed with messages she quickly hid. I memorized the rhythm of their household. When she left for Pilates, when she returned with a new bag, the cadence of her steps. I learned where she kept the spare keys. I learned painfully how close my son was to being blind to the truth because of his love. Then I escalated quietly. I asked Maria to check a few business names and see whether any shell accounts or unusual cash flows were connected to them. She found something. A small landscaping contractor, Greenridge Services, had been paid. Odd amounts on a recurring schedule in 2019 and 2020. Amounts that matched withdrawals on days my son had reported her shopping sprees. The contractor's listed owner was a woman with initials matching the name in one of the messages I'd seen on her phone. Maria's fingers flew across her laptop like she was knitting a truth out of numbers. "It's not huge," she said, "but it's consistent. Follow the money and it leads somewhere." I knew I couldn't confront her with conjecture. I needed a public, undeniable moment. A place where witnesses would stare and questions would be asked out loud. So I did something I hadn't done. In years, I called an old family friend, Lorraine, who organized our neighborhood's annual charity bazaar. Lorraine still had pull and an appetite for spectacle. She loved gatherings where reputations could be politely repaired or indelibly stained. I offered to help with the bazaar's jewelry stall, A perfect cover. Do it, Lorraine said, delighted. Bring your boxes. We'll have the community there on Saturday. I volunteered to run the register. It was simple theater, a room full of neighbors, a linen-draped table, a volunteer photographer, the kind of place where someone's behavior can't hide behind excuses. On the day of the bazaar, I wore the cardigan my husband liked, the one he always said made me look steady. I brought the pawn slip in my handbag and tucked it next to an old ledger so it would be close if I needed it. I placed my recorder in my coat pocket and spent the afternoon watching people move through the stall, smiling and trading small talk. She arrived naturally 5 minutes late, wearing sunglasses even though the hall was dim. She carried a new clutch that, to my eye, matched one of the receipts I'd found. She lingered near the bake sale, then drifted to our stall with a practiced casualness that used the room like scenery. I greeted her kindly, as every good trap must begin with kindness. "So glad you could help," I said, the simplest sentence a net can be made of. As the afternoon wore on, I let the moment unfold. I intentionally dropped a comment about estate jewelry being sentimental, softening it for the crowd. I mentioned, in passing, that sometimes family heirlooms show up in pawn shops. A little hint, nothing direct. Her hand tightened on the clutch. She smiled too quickly. Then a neighbor, a nosy woman named Joan, who loved to gossip and had a keen memory for faces, asked where we had gotten such unique pieces. Joan's eyes slid to her, and she asked aloud, "Didn't your husband have a ring like that?" The room's hum dipped for a second. Conversations paused. Joan's question was harmless, but questions rippled. My son, who had come to volunteer with a sandwich, looked up, confusion in his face. He hadn't been prepared. That's when she made a mistake. In front of neighbors whose faces I knew, she laughed and said, "Oh, that? Pieces come and go. You know how it is." It was a throwaway line, meant to waft away attention, but Joan, who loved specifics, pressed, "Pieces. When did you sell Grandma's ring?" Her voice was perfectly loud enough. My son's fork stilled. My heart hammered so loud I worried it would betray my calm. She looked at him, the way a predator looks at prey that doesn't yet hurt. Her mouth formed the word long as if repeating the pawn slip story by rote. "I sold it long ago." This time the room's pause cracked into murmurs. My son's face folded. His napkin dropped to the table. He stood up so fast his chair scraped. For a flicker, I thought he might run outside and apologize, or laugh it off, or demand to know. Instead, he turned to me, eyes trying to find reason in my face. He trusted me to be the teller of truth. I reached into my bag and, without preamble, placed the pawn slip and the photograph on the table. The paper slid across the linen like a dare. Silence pressed again, heavier. My son read the slip, then the photo, then the transfer amount. The color drained from his face as if someone had unplugged him from the world he'd been living in. Her reaction in that room, with neighbors looking on and my son's breath caught in his chest, was the thing I needed. She stumbled, then tried the old strategy, charm and dismissal. But people can smell fear, and her practiced smile didn't hold. A neighbor who worked at the bank asked polite but direct questions about joint accounts and recent transfers. Another neighbor, who'd once owned a small boutique, recognized the brand on her bag, the same line traced on a receipt I'd found. Threads crossed in public, and the tapestry of her lies began to fray where everyone could see. My son asked a single simple question, the kind that cuts through excuses. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her answer was thin. I thought I could fix it." The admission was half plea, half confession, and in that moment, with the sun through the hall windows catching the dust motes and every neighbor's eyes on the table, everything shifted. He didn't immediately rage. The shock kept him still. But his silence was not peace. It was the holding breath before a storm. I left the bazaar that evening with more than the satisfaction of a plan taking shape. I left with a promise in my bones. I would not allow this woman to keep rewriting my family's history. I had pulled one thread and watched the weave come undone in a room full of witnesses. The next moves would be legal, careful, and unavoidable. I would not be the old woman who screamed at weddings. I would be the quiet that organizes events so that truth has nowhere to hide. The bazaar was only the beginning. The whispers that followed her admission spread faster than wildfire in a dry field. By Sunday night, 3 different neighbors had accidentally called me, each with their own version of concern, each asking if what they heard was true. I didn't confirm, I didn't deny. I simply said, "My son and I are handling it." That phrase was enough to fuel the rumor mill without painting me as the instigator. She had cornered herself, and the community had seen it with their own eyes. All I had to do was let her unravel. That Monday morning, I met with the lawyer again, the pawn slip and Facebook photos neatly stapled into a packet. He skimmed the pages, leaned back in his chair, and said the words I'd been waiting for. "This is enough to open discovery." Legal language, calm and clinical, but I felt my pulse quicken. Discovery meant paperwork. It meant subpoenas. It meant no more hiding behind laughter and excuses. He explained carefully that my son needed to be the client, that I could only prepare him, not fight for him. So I walked home with that weight pressing on me. The hardest step was still ahead, convincing my own child to see the truth. That night I made his favorite dinner, roast chicken with garlic potatoes, the way my husband used to make it. I set the table carefully, every plate in place, the air thick with the smell of rosemary. He arrived late, shoulders hunched, eyes heavy from another long shift. He barely touched his food. Finally, I said softly, "I know about the ring." His fork stopped midair. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then quietly, he said, "I saw the slip." His voice was flat, almost rehearsed, as though he had practiced denying it to himself for hours. I pushed further, telling him what I had found, the transfers, the messages, the pawnshop clerk's memory. His hands shook as he set the fork down. "She said it was an emergency," he whispered, like a child confessing a broken toy. "She said she needed the money for a medical bill." My heart clenched. That lie, cold, rehearsed, weaponized, had bought her years of his silence. I reached across the table and laid the photo of her bare hand on Christmas Day beside the pawn slip. He stared at it for so long I worried he wouldn't come back. Then he whispered, "I don't even know what's real anymore." His voice cracked. He left the table and went outside, pacing the porch like a man trapped in a shrinking cage. I let him breathe. Sometimes the truth needs silence to settle into bone. The next day, she sensed the shift. She became suddenly sweet, cooking dinners, complimenting his shirts, even offering me tea in the afternoons. Her charm was a thin veil over panic. I could see it in her eyes, the way she avoided looking at the sideboard where my ledger now sat like a quiet sentinel. One evening when she thought I had gone to bed, I heard her in the kitchen on the phone. Her voice was low, but not low enough. "He's asking questions," she hissed. "She's turning him against me. We need to move fast." My hands clenched in the dark hallway, recording every word in my memory. By the end of that week, the lawyer had prepared a draft of what he called protective filings, essentially a way to freeze joint accounts until documentation was reviewed. My son was hesitant, still clinging to the belief that love could survive this storm. But when the letter arrived, she erupted. She stormed into the kitchen, waving the paper like a flag. "What is this?" she shrieked. "Do you not trust me?" My son sat silent at the table, his head in his hands. I stood in the doorway, watching her perform. When he finally looked up, his eyes were no longer confused ones, they were tired. "Why would I need to do this?" he asked quietly. "If you had nothing to hide?" Her mask cracked. For the first time, I saw fear ripple across her face. She stammered excuses about paperwork, about misunderstandings, about a friend who needed cash. Each excuse thinner than the last. And then, in desperation, she turned her fury on me. "This is your fault," she spat. "You've been poisoning him against me since the beginning." I didn't raise my voice. I simply stepped forward, placed the notebook on the table, and opened it to the pages filled with dates, amounts, and evidence. The sound of the spine creaking open was louder than her words. My son leaned forward, reading page after page. His jaw tightened with every line. That was the moment I knew she was done. Not legally yet, not publicly yet, but spiritually her game had ended. Because my son, the boy I raised to trust his instincts, had finally seen the truth laid out in ink, undeniable and cold. And once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. The protective filing was only the beginning of the unraveling. Within days, her tone shifted from fury to desperation. She tried everything, cooking elaborate meals, leaving notes on the fridge, even suggesting family counseling as though the problem was miscommunication instead of betrayal. My son avoided her eyes, his movements stiff, his words clipped. I watched from the sidelines, my heart breaking for him, but I stayed steady. Because I knew the final blow needed to come not from me, but from the truth itself. It arrived faster than I expected. 2 weeks later, we received a letter from the bank, an official notice of irregular withdrawals and flagged accounts tied to her name. The numbers were stark: $22,000 over 3 years, siphoned in small amounts, all leading back to the same shell contractor Maria had traced. My son held the letter in his hands at the dinner table, the silence stretching so long that even the refrigerator hum seemed loud. Finally, he stood, walked into the living room, and placed the letter in her lap without a word. Her reaction was a performance I'll never forget. First came denial, wild, frantic, waving her hands as if the numbers were lies typed by ghosts. Then came tears, heavy and dramatic, dripping onto the paper. "I only did it for us," she sobbed. "I was trying to build something to surprise you." My son, who had once melted at her every tear, sat stone-faced. He didn't yell, he didn't move. He just asked, "Where's the ring?" That question, simple, precise, sliced through every excuse. She froze. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Because the truth had already been spoken in front of the neighbors, in front of me, in front of the pawn slip that carried the date like a wound. Silence fell heavy, and in that silence her power crumbled. The next step was inevitable. My son agreed to meet the lawyer. Papers were drafted. Divorce proceedings began, with the evidence I had gathered forming the backbone of the case. But before the courtrooms and signatures, there was the night everything shattered in front of our extended family. It was a Sunday dinner, one of the rare times cousins, uncles, and siblings gathered around our long oak table. She insisted on attending, insisting she could fix this if only people saw them united. My son, weary but resolute, agreed, perhaps to let the truth breathe in the open air. The table was set with roast beef, casseroles, laughter echoing off the walls. But under it all was a tension thick enough to choke on. Halfway through the meal, my niece, young, curious, unafraid of asking blunt questions, turned to her and said, "Auntie, where's your wedding ring? Mommy says you always wore it." The table went silent, forks frozen mid-air. Her eyes darted, her face pale. She forced a smile and said, "I don't wear it anymore." Too small, that was the moment. My son stood, walked to the buffet cabinet, and pulled out the folder of documents I had prepared. He laid them on the table, one by one, the pawn slip, the bank letters, the messages I had printed out from her phone, each page like a hammer striking wood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply said, "Tell them why you sold it." Gasps filled the room. My brother muttered under his breath. My niece's fork clattered to her plate. She stammered, "It wasn't like that." But her words dissolved in the weight of evidence. My son pressed the final blow. "You sold the one thing that mattered most to my family, and you sold me along with it." Her mask cracked completely. She screamed, sobbed, begged, accusing me again, accusing everyone, flinging her hands as though rage could undo the ink on those papers. But my son didn't move. He turned, walked out of the dining room, and left her standing in the wreckage of her lies. And this time the family didn't chase after her. They turned their eyes to me, some in shock, some in gratitude, all of them finally seeing what I had seen for years. That night she packed a bag. By morning she was gone. But the damage she had done lingered, heavy and raw. My son sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, whispering, "How did I not see it? How did I let this happen?" I laid my hand on his shoulder, steady and firm. "Because you loved her," I said softly. "And love makes us blind. But now you see." The morning after she left, the house felt both quiet and raw, like a wound exposed to air. My son didn't touch his breakfast. He sat with the divorce papers spread in front of him, his pen hovering but not moving. I knew what held him back, not doubt, but grief. He wasn't grieving her. He was grieving the years lost, the faith misplaced, the version of himself that had believed in her promises. I stayed nearby, silent, letting him wrestle with his decision. When he finally signed, the scratch of the pen against paper sounded louder than thunder. That line of ink was the first step toward freedom. The lawyer moved quickly. Within weeks, the accounts were frozen, subpoenas were issued, and her web of lies began to collapse under scrutiny. Records showed not only the pawned ring and the siphoned money, but also her payments into that sham landscaping company. When investigators traced it further, it led to a second account in her name, one she had kept hidden, filled with just enough to show she'd been stashing money away for herself. The evidence was clean, undeniable. She, of course, tried to fight back. She hired her own attorney, painting herself as a victim of circumstance, claiming she'd been forced to sell the ring, that she'd been pressured into spending money to keep up appearances. But the judge wasn't swayed. The documentation told the story better than either of us ever could. I sat in the courtroom behind my son, clutching the leather strap of my purse, watching her twist in her seat as her own attorney tried to spin lies into fabric strong enough to hold. It kept tearing apart in his hands. The final blow came when Tom, the pawnshop clerk, was called as a witness. He spoke calmly, clearly, recalling her visit, the haste with which she sold the ring, the cash exchanged. When he confirmed the date, matching the slip in evidence, her head dropped. For the first time in months, she didn't speak. She didn't cry. She simply sat there, cornered. When the ruling came down, it was swift. The marriage dissolved. Financial restitution ordered. Her reputation in the community, already frayed, was shredded completely. She moved out of town within weeks, unable to face the whispers that followed her through every grocery aisle and gas station. The woman who once strutted in designer shoes now slunk into shadows, and I felt no pity. My son stayed with me for a while, rebuilding his footing. Nights were the hardest. I would hear him pacing the porch, muttering to himself, asking questions only time could answer. How could I not see it? How did I waste so many years? I never scolded him. I never said, "I told you so." I only reminded him that the strongest men aren't the ones who never fall. They're the ones who stand up again after the fall. Slowly, he began to heal. He took extra shifts not out of desperation but out of choice. He started sketching again, plans for furniture, talking about maybe opening that workshop after all. His shoulders stood straighter, his eyes brighter, the fog lifting one day at a time. The house felt lighter, even with the empty chair at the table. Sometimes absence is the heaviest thing in a room, and sometimes it's the most liberating. As for me, I didn't celebrate her downfall with champagne or laughter. Revenge, I learned, doesn't always look like victory dances. Sometimes it looks like ink on a subpoena, silence in a courtroom, or a son finally signing his name on the line that frees him. Sometimes it looks like the weight of a ring gone forever, replaced by the weight of truth that will never leave. The divorce papers were filed. The hearings concluded, and just like that, she was no longer part of our family. But endings are never clean. Even after the gavel struck, her shadow lingered. She had always cared more about appearances than substance, and now those appearances were what destroyed her. The community that once admired her style now whispered about the pawn slip, the bank records, the courtroom confession. At church, people turned their faces politely, but their eyes betrayed judgment. At the grocery store, the cashier who once complimented her handbags now gave clipped greetings. Reputation is a fragile currency, and she had spent hers recklessly. I watched her unravel from a distance. Word reached me through neighbors. She had moved into a small apartment outside town, No designer bags, no parties, no husband to fund the facade. She was seen working part-time at a boutique, her smile thinner, her clothes simpler. Some pitied her. I did not. Because pity is reserved for those who fall by accident, not those who dig their own graves. My son, meanwhile, carried the heavier burden: healing. Papers and rulings can end a marriage legally, but they cannot erase the years invested, the memories tainted, the trust shattered. He walked through the house like a man carrying weights invisible to the eye. At night, I'd hear him at the dining table, staring at old photos, his fingers pressed to his temples. One evening, I found him holding the empty ring box, the one I had given him the day he proposed. His shoulders shook, not with tears but with anger. "She sold more than a ring, Mom," he whispered. "She sold everything I believed in." I sat beside him, my hand steady on his back. "No," I told him quietly. "She sold what was never hers to keep. What you gave, your love, your time, that was real. That can't be sold." He didn't answer, but I saw the words settle into him like stones into still water. Healing is slow, but truth plants roots even in burned soil. In the weeks that followed, he began to find pieces of himself again. He worked longer hours not to escape, but to rebuild. He reconnected with old friends she had driven away. He smiled tentatively at first, then with more ease. The weight didn't disappear, but it grew lighter. Watching him slowly return to the man he once was gave me strength, too. As for me, I thought often about the ring, about how it was gone forever, melted into someone else's life, stripped of its history. The loss cut deep. But I realized something important. The real heirloom wasn't the band of gold. It was the lesson carved into our family now, that love without respect is theft, that silence in the face of lies is complicity, and that sometimes the bravest act is not to scream, but to document, to wait, and then to act when the truth can no longer be denied. I kept the pawn slip, folded carefully in my notebook, not out of bitterness, but as a reminder that even in old age, when people assume you are fragile or blind, you can be the one who sees most clearly. And I promised myself never again would I allow someone to mistake my kindness for weakness. Months passed, and the rhythms of life began to return, though never quite the same. My son moved into his own apartment, a modest place near the river with wide windows that let the light in. The first time I visited, he was sanding a wooden chair he'd built himself. Sawdust covered the floor, sunlight streaming across his tired but determined face. "It's not perfect," he said, running a hand across the uneven edge. But I saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there for years: pride. He was reclaiming himself piece by piece, not as her husband, not as her provider, but as his own man. Our family gatherings slowly healed too. At Thanksgiving, the empty chair at the table no longer ached. It felt like space reclaimed. My nieces and nephews laughed louder, my brother brought his guitar again, and my son even joined in the singing, his voice hoarse but steady. The shadow she had cast on our family dinners lifted, and in its place there was a quiet gratitude. For truth, for resilience, for the strength that had carried us through. I still kept the notebook locked away, though I no longer needed it for proof. It had become a symbol, not of revenge but of vigilance. Every time I opened the drawer and saw its spine, I reminded myself that silence is not always noble. Sometimes silence allows rot to grow. I thought back to the years I had stayed quiet, convincing myself that it wasn't my place, that love would fix what I could not. Those years nearly cost my son everything. Never again, I promised myself. Never again would I mistake patience for powerlessness. As for her, she faded like a ghost from our lives. I heard whispers that she tried to remarry quickly, that the new man discovered her habits before vows could be exchanged, that she left town again, carrying her charm like a mask she could no longer keep from cracking. She became a story neighbors told in low voices, a warning passed along over coffee and fences. Be careful who you let in. Not every smile is sincere. There were nights I lay awake thinking about the ring, about the metal that had circled my finger, then my son's wife's, now melted into some stranger's hand. The thought still stung, but I came to see that maybe it was fitting. Gold is only metal. It can be melted, reshaped, stolen. What cannot be stolen is the lesson it left behind. And in that way, the ring was still with us. Heavier than before, etched not on our hands but on our hearts. One evening, sitting on the porch with my son, watching the sky turn orange, he said quietly, "You saved me." His voice was steady, not broken. I turned to him and shook my head. "No, you saved yourself. I just made sure you saw what was already there." He didn't argue. He simply leaned back in his chair, the kind he had built himself. And for the first time in years, I saw peace settle over his face. Winter came, and with it the long nights that once would have been filled with her chatter and drama. But now the evenings in our home were different, quieter, steadier. My son often came over after work, carrying groceries in his calloused hands, insisting on cooking simple meals for the two of us. Pasta with garlic, hearty stews, nothing extravagant. But each dish carried weight because it was his, not hers. Sometimes we ate in silence, sometimes he told me stories from work, and sometimes we laughed. The kind of laughter that rises naturally, without effort. It reminded me of when he was a boy, before life had tangled him in someone else's lies. The community, too, shifted. Neighbors who once envied her wardrobe now avoided saying her name. At church, no one asked about her anymore. They asked how my son was holding up, how I was managing. The whispers faded not into forgetfulness but into caution. She had become a parable, a story retold as warning. Do you remember that woman who sold her wedding ring? Do you remember what happened to her? And while part of me still burned with anger at the loss of the ring, another part felt a grim satisfaction knowing she had branded herself by her own choices. But healing isn't simple. There were nights when my son still woke in anger, muttering that he should have seen it sooner. He confessed once, his voice low in the dark kitchen, "I think I hate myself more than I hate her." I placed my hand over his, steady and unshaking. "Don't," I told him. "You trusted, and trust is not weakness. The shame belongs to her, not you." He didn't answer, but I saw his shoulders ease just a fraction. Those small eases became steps toward his freedom. Slowly, he began to dream again. He bought secondhand tools, set up a workbench in his garage, and started building furniture. Tables, shelves, pieces that carried his craftsmanship. He sold one to a neighbor, then another, and soon word spread. Orders trickled in, not enough to replace his job yet, but enough to remind him that his talent had value. Watching him regain purpose filled me with pride deeper than words. He was no longer the man bent under the weight of her expectations. He was becoming himself again. As for me, I wrestled with my own reflection. There were moments I sat in my bedroom at night, staring at the empty space on my dresser where my ring once rested before I passed it down. I thought of my husband, of his rough hands slipping that band onto my finger decades ago, and sometimes the ache nearly consumed me. But then I would remember, a ring is metal, memory is flesh. What he gave me, years of loyalty, children, a home built with his sweat, those could not be sold, not even by her. The anger that had once driven me began to soften into something else. Clarity. I saw more sharply than ever how fragile love can be when built on lies, how dangerous silence is when it covers rot, and how even at my age, I was not powerless. I had been the quiet witness, the steady hand recording dates and times, the voice that refused to be drowned out. And that, I realized, was my inheritance to my son. Not money, not gold, but the strength to see clearly and act when the time demanded it. By spring, the house felt alive again. My son planted flowers in the yard, marigolds and tulips that burst into color against the gray fence. He grilled food on Sundays, inviting family over, their laughter once more filling the air. The chair at the table no longer felt empty. It felt reclaimed. And though the wound was still healing, the scar forming, I knew we were moving toward light. Spring rolled into summer, and with it came the weight of anniversaries. The first birthday without her. The first holiday meal where her absence wasn't explained, just accepted. At first, the silence around her name felt heavy, like everyone was tiptoeing around an open wound. But slowly, the silence shifted into something else. Relief. No one had to perform anymore. My son no longer had to pretend everything was fine when it wasn't. I no longer had to bite my tongue through dinners where her voice dominated the room. What remained was quieter, but it was honest. Yet honesty comes with its own pain. My son admitted one evening, sitting on the porch with a beer in his hand, "Sometimes I miss her." I didn't flinch. I knew he wasn't missing the woman she truly was, but the version he thought she had been. The one who laughed at his jokes, the one who made him believe he was the center of her world. "You're not missing her," I said gently. "You're missing the dream you built with her. That's what hurts." He stared into the twilight, nodded once, and whispered, "Then I'll build a different dream." That sentence was the first time I believed he would truly recover. I saw her once more, unexpectedly. At the farmer's market on a Saturday morning, she stood at a stall buying cheap jewelry, costume pieces, nothing like the gold she once flaunted. She wore oversized sunglasses, though the sky was cloudy, and her posture was smaller, as if the world had pressed her down. She noticed me but didn't approach. Instead, she turned sharply, clutching her paper bag, and walked away. I watched her retreating figure and felt nothing. No triumph, no rage, just emptiness. She had become irrelevant to me, like a chapter in a book I no longer cared to reread. That, I realized, was the true victory. Meanwhile, my son began to find joy in small things again. He built a dining table that stretched across the kitchen, sturdy and simple, and when the family gathered for Sunday meals, we all sat around it with pride. He joked that it was the first table not paid for by lies. He was right. It was built with his own hands, his own sweat, and it carried no shadow. Every meal we ate on it felt like reclaiming ground she had tried to poison, but not all wounds were visible. Sometimes late at night, I would hear him pacing, his footsteps heavy on the floorboards. Sometimes he would wake in anger, muttering words like, "How could she?" And I was such a fool I didn't correct him anymore. Instead, I reminded him of the truth, that being fooled by love is not weakness, it is humanity. And that the real shame belonged only to her. Over time, those nights grew fewer. He began to sleep more soundly, his dreams no longer shackled by her lies. As for me, I learned something I hadn't expected, that revenge is not a single moment. Not the pawn slip on the table or the courtroom confession. Revenge is the long, slow process of watching someone who thought they were clever undo themselves. It's the patience of waiting until the truth is undeniable. It's the strength of staying steady while lies collapse under their own weight. And in that sense, the sweetest revenge wasn't that she lost everything, it was that we found ourselves again. By late summer, the house and garden had transformed. Flowers bloomed where weeds once grew. My son's workshop in the garage buzzed with life, orders coming in from neighbors who admired his work. The laughter of children playing outside drifted through open windows, and the house that once felt haunted by deceit now felt alive again. And though the absence of the ring still pricked at me like a splinter, I came to see that it no longer defined us. What defined us was endurance, the refusal to be erased, the decision to keep moving forward even when betrayal tried to stop us. Autumn arrived with its crisp air and falling leaves, and with it came a sense of balance I hadn't felt in years. Life didn't return to what it had been before her. It couldn't. Too much had been burned away. But in place of what was lost, something sturdier grew, something less fragile. My son and I had weathered the storm and stood on the other side, scarred but stronger. By then, his workshop had become more than a hobby. Orders came from outside the neighborhood. A cafe downtown asked for handmade shelves. A teacher commissioned desks for her classroom. Even the church asked him to restore old pews. He worked with his hands the way his father once had, sweat beading on his brow, sawdust clinging to his clothes. And when he finished a project, his eyes shone with the kind of quiet pride that can't be bought, only earned. Watching him reclaim that part of himself was more healing than any courtroom ruling could ever be. Family gatherings shifted too. The first Christmas without her, I expected awkwardness, questions, maybe even sorrow. Instead, what I found was laughter. Real laughter, not the brittle kind that once filled the room when she performed her charm. My nieces brought desserts. My brother played his guitar. My son carved the turkey with steady hands. When the meal was over, no one rushed out. We lingered, trading stories, filling the air with warmth. For the first time in years, I felt our family breathe freely again, and yet the ghost of her lingered in small ways. At the grocery store, I overheard whispers. That's the woman whose daughter-in-law sold the ring. At church, a neighbor leaned in and asked if it was true, if she really did all those things. I answered calmly, without bitterness. Yes, and it's finished now. I refused to let her name live in my mouth like poison. Let others gossip, I had no need. My silence was louder than any rumor. Still, late at night, I sometimes thought of her. Not with rage, not even with sorrow, but with a kind of cold clarity. I wondered if she lay awake in whatever apartment she rented now, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the life she had thrown away. I wondered if she thought of the ring, not as gold, but as the symbol of love and loyalty she had shattered for a handful of bills. Maybe she felt regret. Maybe she didn't. It no longer mattered. Because regret does not repair. It does not return. One afternoon, as I cleaned the attic, I found an old box of letters from my husband. Faded ink, worn paper, his words of love written in a hand roughened by labor. I sat on the floorboards reading each one slowly, tears slipping down my cheeks. That was love. That was what the ring had represented. And though the metal was gone, the love remained, alive in memory, alive in the man our son had become. That realization steadied me. She had stolen gold, but she had not stolen love. By the time the leaves turned and winter came again, I no longer saw myself as the woman who lost her ring. I was the woman who had defended her family, who had stood her ground, who had chosen truth over silence. And I understood now that revenge had never been about punishing her. It had been about reclaiming what was ours: dignity, clarity, strength. That was the victory I carried with me every single day. Now, when I sit on the porch in the evenings, the air cool against my skin and the sound of crickets filling the silence, I think less about what was lost and more about what was saved. My son walks taller now, his hands rough again from honest work, his eyes no longer clouded by her manipulations. The house feels lighter, not because the shadows are gone, but because we chose not to let them stay. I look at the dining table he built, the flowers he planted, the laughter he's brought back into these walls, and I know that in the end, we won. Not with shouting, not with violence, but with patience, truth, and the courage to face lies head-on. I still keep the pawn slip folded in the back of my notebook. Sometimes I take it out and hold it, not to mourn, but to remember. To remember that even when others try to erase your history, you can fight back. You can hold the line. You can remind them, and yourself, that love, loyalty, and sacrifice are not things to be sold. They are the backbone of who we are, and that backbone does not break easily, no matter how hard someone tries. My son once asked me if I regretted giving him that ring, knowing how it ended. I looked him in the eyes and told him no, because love is never wasted, even when it's betrayed. What he gave her was pure, and that is something she can never take away. The shame is hers, not his, and the strength we found after, that belongs to us. Now when neighbors whisper, I don't flinch. When people ask, I don't feel shame. I only feel certainty that I did what needed to be done, that I protected my son when he could not see, that I reminded him of his worth when someone else tried to strip it away. And that, in the end, is the kind of legacy I want to leave behind. So yes, the ring is gone forever, but the truth, the dignity, the lessons, those remain. They are heavier than gold, and they shine brighter too. And I wonder, as I sit here tonight, if you had been in my place. If your daughter-in-law had sold the ring that symbolized your entire marriage, your sacrifices, your family's love, what would you have done? Would you have stayed silent, or would you have fought back the way I did? Tell me, ladies, What would your choice have been?